Ed Sullivan stood in his office holding a fire extinguisher and staring at Jimi Hendrix with an expression that moved between disbelief and pure rage. It was March 18, 1968, and Jimi Hendrix had just finished his rehearsal for that night's show. The rehearsal had been fine, professional, exactly what Ed had hoped for. But then Hendrix's roadie had started loading equipment, and Ed had seen something that made his blood run cold. Lighter fluid. A lighter, and what looked like an accelerant spray can. Ed's stage manager had immediately pulled the roadie aside. "What is that for?" The roadie, nervous but honest, had said the words that sent Ed storming into Hendrix's dressing room. "Jimi lights his guitar on fire sometimes. At the end of fire, it's part of the show." Ed was now standing in that dressing room, fire extinguisher in hand, looking at Jimi Hendrix like he was looking at a man who just announced plans to detonate a bomb. "You want to set something on fire on my stage? On live television? In a building made of wood?" Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to witness is the night when the most dangerous guitarist in the world discovered that Ed Sullivan's fear of fire was even stronger than his desire for ratings. To understand why Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar on fire was Ed Sullivan's nightmare, you need to understand what Hendrix had already done at other venues. By the mid-1960s, Hendrix had moved to London, where he'd found audiences more willing to accept a black guitarist playing blues rock with unprecedented virtuosity. He'd formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience with Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums, and they'd become the hottest live act in England. But America, his home country, hadn't fully embraced him yet. The guitar burning at Monterey had been Hendrix's attempt to create a moment so memorable that America would have to pay attention. And it had worked. The image of Hendrix kneeling before his flaming Stratocaster had appeared in magazines, newspapers, television news reports. It had become the defining image of Hendrix as a performer, someone willing to destroy what he loved to create something unforgettable. But Hendrix understood that the guitar burning was a one-time trick. He couldn't burn a guitar every night. The expense alone would be prohibitive. More importantly, repeating it would cheapen it, turn a ritual into a gimmick. So Hendrix had been searching for other ways to create that same level of visceral impact, to make audiences feel something beyond just appreciation for musical technique. And now Ed Sullivan had booked him, and Hendrix apparently thought he was going to bring his pyrotechnics to Studio 50. Ed had heard about Hendrix through his younger staff members, who understood that the Jimi Hendrix Experience was the biggest thing in rock music. Purple Haze was climbing the charts. Hey Joe was a hit. And Hendrix himself was a phenomenon, a black guitarist who played with a virtuosity and wildness that nobody had ever seen before. But Ed had also heard the stories. Hendrix didn't just play guitar, he played it with his teeth, behind his back, between his legs. He made sexual gestures with his instrument. He was everything that made Ed Sullivan nervous about rock and roll taken to an extreme that made even Elvis Presley look tame. The booking had been made despite Ed's reservations because the numbers were undeniable. Hendrix was selling out concerts. His albums were flying off shelves. Young viewers loved him, and Ed needed young viewers. But Ed had insisted on conditions, very specific conditions. Hendrix would perform 2 songs. There would be no sexual gestures, no playing guitar with his teeth, and absolutely under no circumstances, no fire. The memo had been sent to Hendrix's management 2 weeks before the show. "Mr. Hendrix is welcome to perform on the Ed Sullivan Show, with the understanding that his performance will be appropriate for family television. Specifically, there will be no destruction of instruments, no fire and no sexually suggestive movements." Hendrix had read this memo while sitting in a hotel room in London, and had laughed out loud. "They want me but they don't want anything I actually do. They want Jimi Hendrix the recording artist, not Jimi Hendrix the performer." His manager had tried to convince him to comply. "Jimmy, it's the Ed Sullivan Show. It's one night. You do it their way, you reach 50 million Americans. Half of them had never heard of you. That's worth not burning a guitar for." Hendrix had seemed to agree. He'd said he understood. He'd said he'd follow the rules. But he'd also said something that should have warned his manager that trouble was coming. "I'll follow the letter of the rules. But the spirit, that's negotiable." Now standing in his dressing room facing Ed Sullivan and a fire extinguisher, Hendrix was completely calm. "Ed, I hear your concern, and I respect it. I won't set my guitar on fire on your stage." Ed had been ready for a fight. The easy capitulation threw him off. "You won't?" "No, sir, you've been very clear. No fire." "I understand and I agree." Ed lowered the fire extinguisher slightly. "Good. Good. I'm glad we understand each other." But Hendrix had smiled then, and it was a smile that made Ed's stage manager nervous. "I won't set my guitar on fire, Mr. Sullivan. But I need to give your audience something. I need to show them why I'm worth watching. So here's what I'm going to do instead." What Hendrix proposed in that moment made Ed Sullivan's face go pale, and yet technically it followed the rules. There would be no fire, no destroyed guitars, nothing that violated the explicit letter of Ed's demands. But the spirit of what Hendrix was planning made fire look tame by comparison. March 18, 1968, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Ed Sullivan introduced the Jimi Hendrix Experience with his characteristic formal delivery, giving no hint of the battle that had been fought backstage. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Jimi Hendrix Experience." Jimi Hendrix walked onto that stage wearing a military jacket covered in braiding, his enormous afro defying gravity, carrying his Fender Stratocaster like it was an extension of his body. The audience, which included a significant number of older viewers who had no idea who Jimi Hendrix was, watched with confusion as this black man with wild hair positioned himself at the microphone. They performed Foxy Lady first, and for 3 minutes Ed Sullivan watched from the wings with growing concern and horror. Because while Hendrix wasn't setting anything on fire, he was doing something that in its own way was more shocking to conservative 1968 television audiences than flames would have been. Hendrix played his guitar in ways that made the instrument unmistakably, unavoidably sexual. He didn't just hold it. He cradled it between his legs and made thrusting motions that left no doubt about what he was simulating. He ran his hands up and down the neck with movements that were explicitly suggestive. His fingers moved across the strings in ways that looked less like playing an instrument and more like making love to one. And the sounds he coaxed from that guitar, they weren't just notes. They were screams and moans and cries that sounded disturbingly uncomfortably human. The guitar seemed to be responding to his touch in ways that made it seem alive, responding, participating in whatever Hendrix was doing to it. Through it all, Hendrix's face held an expression of complete ecstasy that looked like it belonged in the most intimate of private moments, not on national television during family viewing hours. His eyes half closed, his mouth slightly open, his whole body swaying with the music in ways that made every movement seem charged with meaning. Parents watching at home were frozen in their living rooms, remote controls in hand, unsure whether to change the channel immediately or keep watching in shocked fascination. Many couldn't look away even though they wanted to. Their teenage children, meanwhile, were transfixed, seeing something they'd never seen before on television. An artist completely unrestrained, utterly himself, regardless of who was watching or what they thought. Then came Purple Haze, and Hendrix took it even further. During his solo, he turned his back to the camera, dropped to his knees, and played the guitar behind his head. Then he rolled onto his back on the stage floor, still playing, his whole body writhing in ways that made the sexual subtext into text. The studio audience didn't know how to respond. Some were shocked into silence. Others were screaming with excitement. The clash between these reactions created a chaos in the studio that CBS had never broadcast before. When the performance ended, Ed Sullivan walked onto the stage to thank Hendrix, but his face told everyone watching that thank you was not what he was feeling. His voice was tight. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, ladies and gentlemen, no additional comments, no praise, just the minimum acknowledgement required. The moment Hendrix walked off stage, Ed was waiting. My office now. In Ed's office, with the door closed, Ed unleashed fury that had been building since the first pelvic thrust. You promised me no fire. But what you just did on my stage was worse than fire. You simulated sex with your guitar in front of 50 million Americans. You violated every standard of decency that this show maintains. Hendrix sat calmly, almost meditatively. Ed, I kept my promise. No fire. You said nothing about how I could play my guitar. I played it the way I always play it. You know exactly what you did, Ed said. You found a loophole in my rules and you drove a truck through it. You made a fool of me, of my show, of the standards we maintain. Hendrix stood up. With respect, Mr. Sullivan, I didn't make a fool of anyone. I gave your audience what they needed to see. Real music, real passion. Not some sanitized version designed to make advertisers comfortable. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's not my problem. Ed pointed at the door. Get out of my building. You will never appear on this show again. And I will personally make sure that every television network in America knows what you did here tonight. Hendrix walked out of Studio 50 and into a world that was changing faster than Ed Sullivan could comprehend. Because the next morning, the CBS switchboard was flooded with calls, and they weren't all complaints. Many were from younger viewers asking when Hendrix would be back, from people who'd never seen anything like what they'd just witnessed and wanted more. The scandal of Hendrix's performance became a major news story within hours. Newspapers across the country covered it. Television critics debated it. Religious leaders condemned it. Parent groups demanded that CBS institute stricter controls over rock performers. And every single article, every heated debate, every condemnation made more people aware of Jimi Hendrix, made more people curious about what he'd done that was so shocking, made more people want to see this guitarist, who'd somehow managed to be more controversial than setting something on fire. Record stores reported that Hendrix's album sold out the day after the Sullivan appearance. Concert promoters who'd been hesitant about booking him suddenly wanted him headlining their venues. Radio stations that had been playing his music during late-night slots moved him to prime time. The controversy had done exactly what Hendrix had known it would do. It had made him impossible to ignore. Ed Sullivan kept his word about never inviting Hendrix back. But by then it didn't matter to Hendrix's career. He'd already achieved what he needed. He'd shown America who he was, completely unfiltered and absolutely unapologetic. And the part of America that mattered for rock and roll, the young people who were searching for something real and raw and honest, had been paying very close attention. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970, just 2.5 years after that Sullivan Show appearance. He was 27 years old. His death from an overdose cut short what should have been a long career. But in those 2.5 years he'd changed guitar playing forever, had become an icon, had proved that you didn't need Ed Sullivan's approval to matter. Ed Sullivan, when asked about Hendrix after his death, said something surprisingly honest. He was the most talented guitarist I ever had on my show. And he was the most deliberately provocative. He knew exactly what he was doing when he played that way. He knew it would shock people. That was the point. He wanted to shock them. I just wish he'd lived long enough to see if the shock had lasting value. The Ed Sullivan Show performance remains one of Hendrix's most famous television appearances. Not because it was his best performance technically, but because it captured perfectly who Jimi Hendrix was, an artist who would follow the letter of the rules while completely destroying their spirit, who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is give people exactly what they asked for in the most uncomfortable way possible. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Jimi Hendrix promised not to set his guitar on fire, then gave Ed Sullivan something that made fire look tame. Have you ever technically followed the rules while completely violating their intent? Share your story in the comments below.